Hello, everyone. Let's begin today's lecture by acknowledging a fundamental fact. Human diversity is vast and deeply rooted in our global experiences. From forest communities in Central Africa to sea-based cultures in Southeast Asia, the range of human lifestyles is breathtaking. But when we talk about diversity today, especially in educational or organizational settings, it often gets reduced to a buzzword. It shows up in mission statements, job postings, or program goals. The big question is, how do we move from recognizing difference to using diversity as a tool for meaningful social change? If we're serious about equity and justice, diversity can't just be about appreciation. It has to become a framework for identifying and challenging injustice. One of the most common ways diversity is talked about in Canada is through a celebratory lens. This means emphasizing cultural festivals, traditional foods, or colorful clothing, things that are easy to appreciate. And yes, Canada has had important legal milestones that support inclusion. Celebrating diversity without looking at deeper issues like systemic inequality or exclusion can actually be part of the problem. It can make people feel like their cultures are on display rather than being respected in everyday life. We've seen this before, when multiculturalism became more about food and music than about changing systems of power. Another way diversity is often handled is through what's called a difference approach. This looks at identity categories like race, gender, or ability as key areas of focus. Now, recognizing these identities is important, but this approach often ends up treating certain groups as the norm and others as different. That reinforces a kind of invisible standard where one group sets the rules and others are just measured against it. So when we say people should accept difference, it can sound like we're just asking them to tolerate something outside the norm, not to question why certain differences are undervalued in the first place. This way of thinking doesn't address who holds power or how that power shapes opportunity and access. So, what if we thought about diversity differently, not just as a difference to accept or celebrate, but as something connected to justice? An anti-oppression approach focuses on how power and privilege shape our identities and experiences. It recognizes that some groups benefit from systems that disadvantage others. Instead of placing the responsibility on individuals to appreciate diversity, this framework asks us to look at how we can shift structures, how we can create space for those who've been excluded to lead the way. It's not about offering a seat at the table. It's about asking who built the table in the first place and who gets to decide what's on the agenda. That's the kind of shift that makes diversity a tool for real, lasting change. Let's emphasize a key point. There is no one universal theory that fully explains oppression, and there's no single approach to anti-oppressive practice. Oppression is a complex and multifaceted reality. Different scholars and practitioners describe it in different ways based on their own perspectives and experiences. And that's actually okay. There's no need for a one-size-fits-all explanation. What matters is that we understand oppression as something deeply embedded in our institutions, cultures, and social relationships, and that we explore different ways to challenge it. In this course, we draw on a broad framework called critical social theory. This isn't just one theory, it's a collection of perspectives that aim to uncover how power works in society and how we might transform the structures that cause harm. What makes critical social theory different is its political and practical focus. It's not just about studying society, it's about changing it. This approach centers on the idea that the purpose of learning, thinking, and even helping others is to support liberation and justice for those who are marginalized. So, what kinds of theories fall under the critical social theory umbrella? Some focus on gender, pointing to patriarchy as a form of oppression. Others look at racism, ableism, or heterosexism as key forces that shape people's lives. There are also approaches that focus on how dominant cultures control meaning and identity, or how social structures systematically privilege some groups while disadvantaging others. A core theme across these theories is this: Oppression happens at many levels, personal, cultural, and institutional, and it's both visible and hidden. The goal is to identify and challenge those patterns so that everyone, not just a few, can participate fully and equally in society. Many professionals in social services and education recognize that oppression exists. They support individuals who are affected and try to change policies or institutions to make things better. That work matters, but it's often focused on managing the effects of oppression rather than uprooting it. A smaller number of professionals go further. They work toward transformative change, not just helping individuals navigate systems, but trying to change those systems altogether. That's what the anti-oppression approach demands. Not just support, but systemic change. Not just awareness, but action. Let's begin by clarifying what we mean by oppression. It's not just about experiencing hardship or unfair treatment. It's a patterned, systemic form of exclusion that impacts non-dominant groups. This exclusion can be intentional or unintentional, but either way, it limits people's ability to fully participate in society. Oppression operates on three interconnected levels: individual, cultural, and structural. Now, it's important to understand that not every personal struggle or life challenge is oppression. True oppression occurs when someone is denied rights, opportunities, or status because of their perceived or actual membership in a group that society marginalizes. A big part of what keeps oppression going are the beliefs and ideologies we grow up hearing and sometimes internalize without even realizing it. These include the idea that people are to blame for their own circumstances, victim blaming, or that everyone in a group is the same, stereotyping. Other examples are more deeply embedded in how society works. The belief that the strong survive, that hard work equals success no matter the context, the myth of meritocracy, or that the majority is always right even when minority voices are silenced. There are some important dynamics we need to keep in mind. First, oppression isn't a fixed experience. Our positions in relation to power can shift throughout our lives. Second, it's not useful to rank forms of oppression. When we try to decide whether racism is worse than sexism, for example, we fall into a false either-or way of thinking that doesn't reflect how complex real-life experiences are. Third, we all exist in overlapping social identities. Most of us hold both privileged and marginalized identities. In some situations, we might be part of a group that holds power. In others, we may be part of a group that's targeted. We can experience both roles, even at the same time. Understanding this helps us move away from simplistic ideas of good guys versus bad guys and toward a deeper awareness of how power operates. Finally, it's important to think of all three levels of oppression: individual, cultural, and structural, not just as places where oppression happens, but also as potential sites for resistance and change. This means that challenging oppression isn't just about changing laws or big systems. It also includes how we talk, think, interact, and make space for new norms in our communities. Oppression doesn't happen in just one place. It operates on three key levels that are all connected. We can think of these as the personal, cultural, and structural levels. This framework helps us see that oppression is not just about individual actions, but about bigger systems and shared social meanings. At the personal level, oppression shows up in our thoughts, attitudes, and behaviors. These can include stereotypes, prejudice, or outright aggression directed at non-dominant groups. Some of this is easy to see: bullying, name-calling, threats, but often it's more hidden. It can be the way someone avoids eye contact, uses a dismissive tone, or physically distances themselves from someone perceived as other. These small acts can still have a powerful impact, even if they're not intended to harm. Then there's the cultural level, which is about the shared values, norms, beliefs, and language that shape how we view the world. This level is especially powerful because it can normalize inequality. It's where dominant groups define what is seen as normal or superior and use that to justify their position in the hierarchy. Language is a great example here. Words and phrases can either include or exclude, empower or diminish. Inclusive language is not just about being polite, it's about challenging the deep structures that reflect and reinforce power. Finally, there's the structural level. This is where oppression gets built into the institutions and systems of society: laws, policies, education systems, economic models. What makes this level tricky is that it's often invisible. It can be hard to point to a single policy or practice and say that's oppression. But when you zoom out and look at outcomes, who gets access, who holds power, who is routinely left out, you can see the pattern. Because it's so embedded and normalized, structural oppression is often the hardest to fight. But it's also the most important to address if we want real change. All three of these levels are interconnected. They reinforce each other, and they also offer multiple places to resist, push back, and create more equitable systems. So when we analyze oppression, we have to be willing to look beyond individual behavior and examine the culture and structures that allow that behavior to exist in the first place. Let's now look at an especially harmful form of oppression: internalized oppression. This happens when people start to believe the negative stereotypes and messages that society throws at them. It's one thing for a dominant group to promote these messages, but it becomes even more damaging when the targeted individuals or communities begin to accept them as true. At the personal level, this can show up in small but significant ways. Think about someone who stays quiet in a meeting, not because they have nothing to say, but because they've come to believe that their voice doesn't matter. Or a student who decides not to aim high or pursue certain goals because they've internalized the idea that they're not capable or don't belong in those spaces. These are forms of self-defeating behavior, but they're rooted in larger patterns of societal messaging. On the community level, internalized oppression can turn into something that divides rather than unites. Members of the same group may start to judge, criticize, or even undermine each other. For example, someone from a marginalized gender group might support stereotypes about that group, like saying certain jobs are not suited to them. This isn't just individual bias, it reflects how powerful social messaging can be when it gets absorbed by the very communities it harms. It's important to note that not everyone internalizes oppression in this way. Many resist, challenge, and reject these negative messages. But for those who do internalize them, the effects can be serious, damaging their self-esteem, their health, and their ability to form strong connections within their communities. At its worst, internalized oppression makes it harder for people to organize, build alliances, and push for change. It turns people inward instead of outward, focused on self-doubt or distrust rather than collective strength. This is why understanding and addressing internalized oppression is such a crucial part of any anti-oppressive practice. Let's turn now to intersectionality, an idea that helps us understand how different aspects of our identities come together to shape the way we experience the world, including oppression. This concept recognizes that we don't live single-issue lives. We're not just our gender or our race, our class. We're complex, and these pieces of identity don't operate in isolation. Intersectionality helps us see that racism, sexism, classism, ableism, and other forms of oppression don't just pile up. They intersect. That means they work together, forming interconnected systems shaped by history and culture. A woman may experience sexism, but that sexism will look very different depending on whether she's also racialized, living with a disability, or facing poverty. These are not separate issues. They form one complex, lived experience. Sometimes institutions treat these aspects of identity separately. For example, someone might file a discrimination complaint based on gender, or maybe add another category like disability. But even in these additive models, each form of oppression is still treated as if it operates alone, gender plus disability, rather than a single intertwined experience. This kind of model misses how identity actually works in practice. Instead, intersectionality pushes us to go deeper. It tells us to stop thinking in binary terms, like male-female, white-non-white, able/disabled. Those binaries oversimplify people's lives and reinforce a system that privileges one side while marginalizing the other. The matrix of oppression is a tool that helps visualize this. Imagine race, gender, class, age, ability, and other dimensions as overlapping axes, not stacked on top of each other, but crossing over and influencing one another. There's no hierarchy here. No single axis is more important than another. What matters is how they work together to maintain systems of domination. And just as there are axes of oppression, there are also axes of privilege. Depending on our identities and social context, we might benefit from some of these systems while being harmed by others. Ultimately, intersectionality gives us a clearer picture of how injustice operates and how we can fight it more effectively by addressing the full complexity of people's lives. When we talk about oppression, it's important to remember that not everyone within a non-dominant group shares the same experience. For example, not all women experience sexism in the same way. Their race, class, age, ability, and many other factors shape how they encounter gender-based discrimination. Each person carries multiple identities, and these identities aren't static. They shift and evolve depending on time, place, and social context. This complexity is what we call heterogeneity. It's a reality within every form of oppression. Every group, whether based on race, gender, ability, or any other category, has internal diversity. When we take a singular approach to oppression, like focusing only on anti-racism, we risk assuming that all racialized groups experience racism the same way. This kind of thinking overlooks how other identities intersect with race and change the way oppression is experienced. For example, racism looks very different depending on whether someone is wealthy or poor, young or elderly, a newcomer or someone whose family has been in a country for generations. Sexism, classism, ableism, heterosexism. All these systems of oppression are also experienced differently depending on who you are and where you are situated socially. Recognizing heterogeneity helps us move beyond generalizations and stereotypes. It pushes us to see the full complexity of people's lived realities and to build more nuanced, effective strategies for resistance and social change. Bullying is often talked about as a schoolyard issue, but it's actually a much deeper social problem and one that reflects patterns of power and oppression in society. At its core, bullying involves a power imbalance, whether that power is physical, social, emotional, or digital. It can be direct, like name-calling or pushing, or more subtle and relational, like exclusion, spreading rumors, or encouraging others to isolate someone. There are several types of bullying. Verbal bullying involves teasing, threats, and insults. Social or relational bullying is about damaging someone's relationships or reputation, excluding them, spreading rumors, or turning others against them. Physical bullying includes acts like tripping, kicking, or hitting. And now, with social media, we also have cyberbullying, which happens online and can be especially relentless and difficult to escape. Cyberbullying is a growing concern in Canada, especially through platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and others. The case of Amanda Todd and the advocacy work by her mother that followed helped shine a national spotlight on the serious impact of online harassment. One of the most concerning forms of bullying is bias-based bullying. This kind of bullying targets individuals based on real or perceived aspects of their identity, things like race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or disability. For example, homophobic and transphobic bullying is a widespread issue in Canadian schools. A national survey found that a majority of LGBTQ students had experienced verbal harassment, and many had been physically harassed or bullied online. Notably, 73% of LGBTQ students reported feeling unsafe at school, and more than half felt unaccepted. These numbers show just how deeply exclusion is felt and how bullying can reproduce patterns of systemic oppression. It's not just LGBTQ students. Students with disabilities also report high rates of bullying. A 2017 report found that more than a quarter of high school, college, and university students with disabilities in Canada experienced bullying specifically because of their disability. So when we look at bullying through a sociological lens, we can't treat it as just bad behavior. It's part of a larger system of oppression. Bullying mirrors social hierarchies. It punishes those who don't conform to dominant norms, and it reinforces power imbalances. To address it effectively, we have to tackle the root causes, not just the surface behaviors. Let's now explore the concept of privilege, which is often described as the flip side of oppression. Privilege refers to the unearned advantages that come from being part of a dominant group in society. It's not about what we've earned through personal effort. It's about what we receive automatically because of the social categories we fall into. This is a key distinction. Earned advantage comes from effort, but privilege is about what we get without even trying, just by being white, male, able-bodied, straight, or any other identity that holds social power. Because of this, privilege gives one group power over another, often without needing to think about it. Anti-oppressive practice encourages us to examine the role of both power and privilege in our lives. Just like with oppression, privilege isn't something that only applies to other people. We all experience it in some areas of our identity and oppression in others. That's why it's more accurate to say that we have intersecting identities, some of which give us unearned advantages, and others that may expose us to disadvantage or harm. Understanding privilege means recognizing that for oppression to exist, someone must benefit from it. Privilege opens doors, while oppression slams them shut. Privilege allows people to set the social norms, define what's normal, and shape how others are seen and treated. It gives people the power to make judgments that stick, to decide who gets heard, who gets respect, and who gets the benefit of the doubt. One important concept here is the luxury of obliviousness. This is when people with privilege don't have to think about the ways in which they benefit from social systems. They can go through life without noticing how power protects them. Talking about privilege can make people uncomfortable. It challenges our self-image and forces us to think critically about the ways we might benefit from systems we didn't create, but still uphold. Many people would rather focus on oppression because that feels external, while privilege feels personal. But if we avoid looking at our own privilege, we make it harder to change the systems that sustain inequality. And let's be clear, acknowledging privilege isn't about blame or guilt. It's about awareness, recognizing that our social position gives us advantages we didn't ask for is the starting point for meaningful change. Most of us carry a mix of identities, and we've all likely suffered in some ways. So having privilege in one area doesn't cancel out the pain we may have felt in another. The goal here is not to feel bad. It's to get better at seeing the big picture. Once we start recognizing how privilege works and how it intersects with oppression, we can begin the work of unlearning the beliefs and behaviors that keep systems of domination in place. This reflection is key to building a more just society, and it starts with being honest about how systems of privilege benefit us, often without our even noticing. Let's ask some fundamental questions. What would it take to build a society where everyone has equal access to opportunity, where no one feels excluded or undervalued because of their background, where no one is denied basic needs like safe water, education, or freedom from exploitation, simply because of where they were born or who they are? These are justice questions. To address them, we have to understand what social justice and equity really mean, especially in relation to oppression. Social justice isn't just about providing aid or charity. Yes, we absolutely need to support people who are struggling to meet basic needs, food, shelter, healthcare. But if we stop there, we're not solving the problem, we're managing it. A justice-focused approach goes deeper. It asks why poverty exists in the first place. Why are food banks necessary? What systems or policies allow wealth, safety, or access to be concentrated in certain hands while others go without? That's where the idea of distributive and redistributive justice comes in. It's about ensuring that wealth, opportunities, and rights are shared more fairly. But even this model has limits. Giving out resources without changing the systems that control those resources doesn't guarantee justice. It doesn't dismantle the social processes that created the inequity to begin with. That's why we need a broader vision of social justice, one that focuses on eliminating institutionalized domination and oppression. It requires asking hard questions about who gets to set the agenda, make decisions, and control the narrative. And it requires full participation from people who have historically been left out or spoken over. As long as dominant groups are the ones reaching out and expecting marginalized groups to follow their lead, true equity isn't possible. Justice demands that power be shared, that affected communities lead the change, not just be included in it. Now let's clarify an important distinction: equality versus equity. Equality means treating everyone the same. It sounds fair, but it assumes we all start from the same place, and we don't. Equity means giving people what they need to reach the same outcome. It's about acknowledging difference, not ignoring it, and responding to it with fairness and justice. For example, in health, equity doesn't mean everyone gets the same treatment. It means reducing the gaps in health outcomes caused by social disadvantage. In other words, equity is a more flexible, responsive approach. It centers the realities of those who've been underserved or excluded, and it calls for self-definition, letting communities name their own needs, shape their own priorities, and lead their own solutions. Justice and equity aren't just goals, they're processes. And they start when we recognize that diversity isn't just about inclusion, it's about transformation. To really understand the difference between equality and equity, let's look at a powerful classroom example. A professor at the University of Waterloo asked students to sit in a circle and take off their right shoe. He mixed the shoes up and then redistributed one right shoe to each person, randomly. He explained that this was equality. Everyone got exactly one right shoe, and everyone was treated the same. But of course, almost nobody was happy. The shoes didn't fit. Too big, too small, uncomfortable, totally wrong. A student spoke up and said, "This isn't fair. What we need are shoes that actually fit us." That student hit the nail on the head. Equality assumes that everyone is starting from the same place and has the same needs. It means giving everyone the same resources or treatment. But that often leads to unequal outcomes, especially when people come from very different circumstances. Now the professor asked everyone to return the shoes and instead choose the one that fit them best. Chaos broke out, but something important happened. People found shoes that fit. They made choices. Some even traded with others when it made sense. In the end, everyone walked away more comfortable and more satisfied than they had been when they were just given a shoe. This is equity in action. It's not about giving everyone the same thing. It's about giving them what they need, and just as importantly, letting them decide what that is. Equity recognizes that fairness isn't always neat or uniform. It might involve negotiation, flexibility, or even a little bit of disorder. But when people have the power to define their own needs and participate in shaping the outcome, the process is more just, and the results are far more meaningful. This example reminds us that systems based only on equality can fall short, especially for those with different needs. Equity asks us to go further, to tailor our support, share power, and create space for people to shape their own experiences. That's what real fairness looks like. As we begin this journey into social justice and anti-oppression, it's important to ground ourselves in a key truth. There is no single story and no single way of knowing. Who you are, your background, your values, your beliefs, shapes how you see and move through the world. It also shapes what you consider valid knowledge. This isn't just about opinion, it's about power. Our perspectives are deeply connected to social structures and our position within them. In today's world, we often focus on what's measurable: data, algorithms, statistics. These are useful, of course, but they don't tell the whole story. As one university president put it, human stories are what give us energy and meaning. Behind every policy or system are people, real people with hopes, fears, dreams, and lived experience. That's why personal narratives matter so much in anti-oppressive work. They offer an entry point into understanding systems of inequality in ways that numbers simply can't. They help us walk in someone else's shoes and open up dialogue rooted in empathy. Throughout this course, you'll encounter student stories, real experiences from others in post-secondary education across Canada. These narratives aren't just anecdotes, they're acts of resistance. They center voices that have historically been silenced or ignored. They challenge dominant perspectives by showing us what it's like to live with oppression and to fight for change. When we center these voices, we begin to build a more just society, one where diversity isn't just about difference, but about valuing everyone's full humanity. A society where all people feel seen, respected, and empowered to shape the institutions that affect their lives. This is where the journey starts, not with abstract theory, but with real people, real stories, and a commitment to seeing the world through their eyes as well as our own. When we begin exploring concepts like oppression, privilege, and justice, a good place to start is by looking inward at our own identities and experiences. Who we are shapes how we interpret the world, what we value, and how we relate to others. Knowing your story is not just about self-awareness, it's about seeing where you fit in the larger social landscape. We often talk about personal identity, how we describe ourselves based on traits like being hardworking, creative, or kind. We also talk about social identity, how we connect to groups we belong to, our culture, family, religion, or community. These identities aren't separate, they're layered and constantly interacting. Our identities are also fluid and changing. Where you are, who you're with, and what stage of life you're in all shape which parts of your identity feel most relevant at any given time. Someone might strongly identify with their ethnicity in one setting and their profession or ability status in another. Identity is never one size fits all. It's also important to recognize that identity is shaped by power. Certain parts of our identity give us social advantage. Others may lead to exclusion, and some aspects might be invisible unless we disclose them. That means we might be perceived as part of the dominant group, even if parts of our experience don't align with privilege. The danger of reducing anyone to just one label, like race, gender, or ability, is that it flattens who they are. It marks them as different or other, often in ways that imply inferiority. This is why intersectionality matters. Our experiences are not just shaped by one identity, but by how many identities overlap: race, gender, class, sexuality, ability, and more. These overlaps don't add up like a math problem. They interact in complex ways that shift depending on time and context. The textbook student story about a young man living with a brain tumor shows us just how multidimensional identity can be. He doesn't want to be seen as the guy with the tumor. He wants to live and be recognized for all of who he is, not just the one part of him that others focus on. And finally, it's essential to understand that all identities, even ones that seem biological, are socially constructed. Take race, for instance. While it has no biological basis, it has very real social consequences because of how meaning has been assigned to skin color over time. So knowing your own story means seeing both the internal and external forces that shape your identity. It means recognizing when you've been given privilege, when you've been marginalized, and how those experiences influence how you see and navigate the world. This awareness is the first step in becoming more critical, more compassionate, and more committed to justice, not just for others, but in how we understand ourselves.